is I want to talk about some practical stuff related to the officiating of marriage ceremonies. And so we'll talk about policies and prerequisites, preliminaries, and performances of marriages. And I think today probably we'll be able to maybe do this all in one session. We'll see how that goes. If we need to take a break, then certainly we can. But let's start then by talking about wedding policy. And what I mean by this is that every minister who is going to preach the gospel and has the potential at some point in time to officiate weddings, to solemnize marriage vows, every minister needs to have a clear policy rooted in marriage theology and wedding philosophy. You need to have a clear policy on who you will marry and who you will not marry. Now, let me say first of all that you don't have to marry anybody. You don't have to officiate wedding ceremonies at all. For years in the state of Kentucky, you had to be bonded with the county. Somebody had to go down to the county courthouse and sign a bond. I think it was a $500 bond. That basically somebody that owned property in the county, their property would stand on the validity of your ministry and your ability to perform marriages. Now, I'm not sure exactly how that worked, if something, how that happened, if, whatever happened that they'd come and take that property or they'd have to pay that bond if you did something inappropriate, but somebody had to put up their own property to stake in your marriage. Now, you no longer have to be bonded in the state of Kentucky, but for years there were some pastors, especially in our area, that never would go get bonded because that way they could tell people, I'm not bonded, I'm not qualified, I can't officiate with. That was their way out. And so I knew of at least a couple of pastors of our church in Middlesboro through the years that never officiated a wedding. One pastor pastored in our community for over 50 years, buried thousands of people, preached thousands of funerals, and never officiated a single marriage, including his own 12 children. And he had some of his daughters begging, "Daddy, do my wedding," and he would not. And so I want to make that clear that you don't ever have to do a wedding at all. And the reason that I say that is because in 2024, in the last 10 years or so, there has been such a dilemma over marriage officiants and this and that and the other, and with legal repercussions and what have you. And so I know the first question a lot of people ask is, well, Brother Padgett, can you get sued? For refusing to do a wedding, can you get sued? Well, the answer is you can get sued for anything. The answer is yes. Anybody can sue anybody for any reason. But the bigger question is, will that lawsuit does it have any merit? Will it stand up in court? Will it get thrown out? And ultimately, as a minister of the gospel, I don't have to marry anybody that I don't want to marry as a preacher. Now, where you get into legal trouble, and the reason that some of the legal issues have come up in our society in the last 10 years or so is if you're a business, if you're a cake baker, if you own a bakery or whatever, you cannot discriminate. You cannot choose who you're going to sell cake to and who you're not going to sell a cake to. If you own a wedding chapel, that's when you get into legal issues with whether or not you're operating your business and discriminating. As a minister of the gospel, I regularly turn down people all the time. For whatever, and you don't have to have a reason. You can just politely say no or whatever the case is. But whatever the case is, you should have a clear policy, a decision that you've made consciously. And I really recommend that every minister, especially in the beginning of their ministry, determine who I'm going to marry and who I'm not going to marry. Now, it's better to have that policy in place before you ever marry the first couple. But some of you may be joining this seminar a little late and what have you, and you've already officiated some weddings. But I just want to say you should have a clear policy about who you will and who you will not marry. And so in regards to several different things, and I'm going to throw a few things out there. One of those is this idea of same-sex couples, and this is where again our especially litigious culture makes it a relevant question. Now, the Church of God Mountain Assembly teaches against same-sex unions. We teach that any member or minister who condones or knowingly participates in the solemnization of a same-sex union shall be disfellowshipped with the Church of God Mountain Assembly. And so and then later in our bylaws, any minister who solemnizes a same-sex union will lose their credentials. Now, our teachings suggest they'll be disfellowshipped, they'll lose their membership and their ministerial credentials for knowingly participating in the solemnization of a same-sex union or condoning. And I know sometimes people have maybe have some questions about, well, what does that word condone? What does that word condone mean? And when we discussed that, when we were revising our teaching on this subject, one of the things that came up was, should a minister attend a same-sex union? And we determined that even attending is condoning. Your presence there condones that. One of the principles that's founded on is sometimes there's a wide number of different wedding liturgies that you might use in a service, but I have been to numerous weddings where the preacher says something along the lines of, Christ adorned and beautified with his presence and first miracle at the marriage of Cana of Galilee. That is, that there was something about Jesus even being at the wedding in Cana of Galilee that legitimized the idea of marriage. Christ attended, he performed a miracle there. And so even in some wedding liturgies, it recognizes the presence of that Jesus showed up as if to endorse the idea of marriage, the idea of a marriage celebration. And so again, your very presence, now somebody would say, well, what if, it was a wedding that, some other thing that you didn't agree with, or what about, divorce, and you don't really believe that person had a legitimate reason for divorce, and if you show up at that wedding, that's not exactly the same thing. You're not endorsing that couple necessarily. You're endorsing the idea of marriage. And so our teachings, the position of the Church of God Mountain Assembly is such that we don't recognize that as a legitimate marriage. Period. And so again, so your policy should start with, I refuse, I will not solemnize any same-sex union. Now, the second thing is on the idea of divorcees, somebody who has been previously married, and whether or not you're willing to marry them in a second marriage. And I know there are a number of ministers whose convictions are such that they will not participate in the solemnization of a second marriage. Someone who has been divorced, whose previous spouse is living, and so they just refuse to do any weddings for that in that regard. Come on and sit down, Brother Josh. Let me say about that I respect everybody's convictions on the matter. Again, you don't have to marry anybody you don't want to marry, and so if that's your policy, that is perfectly legitimate, and you're welcome to you're welcome to formulate your policy based on your convictions. What we know about the Scripture is that God's plan for marriage was one man, one woman for life. We know that. We know that God hates divorce. That's what the Bible teaches. The Bible says that divorce was never God's plan, never from the beginning. Jesus makes that clear. From the beginning, that was his plan. Jesus also said, the Old Testament law gave provision for divorce, and Jesus even, in a couple of places, makes reference to the fact, except it be for fornication. And so Jesus, if the scripture gives legitimate reasons for divorce and remarriage, then I think we ought to at least be willing to consider that. And so again, the question is whether or not I will, again, you don't have to, you can say, you know what, I'm just going to say no all the way around, and then that way I don't have to fool with whether or not you've got a legitimate, if I say no, I'm not going to marry anybody who has been divorced, I'm not going to officiate those weddings, then you never have to sit down and get to deep. You don't have to have long conversations whether you feel like the marriage, whether the divorce was legitimate or whether or not they had biblical grounds. You don't have to play the guessing game. You just set the policy. A third thing you might consider also, and some ministers, have this as their as part of their policy, that they won't marry anybody that's not a member of the church, nobody that's outside. And I'm using the word member rather loosely. That the idea is that whether they've actually stood up in front of the congregation and been given the right hand of fellowship and become incorporated into whether their name is on a dusty ledger roll somewhere is not the idea that's behind that. But some pastors won't marry anybody who is outside their church. Again, it's another level of protection. You can just say, no, you know what, I'm just going to marry the members of my congregation. That's all that I'm going to focus on. And so, again, you've got to set your own policy on who you will and will not marry. And along, connected to that also is this idea of marrying unbelievers. Whether or not, one thing, whether you say, I'm not going to marry anybody that's outside of my church. You could even say, you know what, I'm just not, if people don't have a relationship with Christ, then how can they possibly understand the theological significance of this event? How can they understand the mystical union between Christ and his church if they're not part of that? And so some ministers will say, you know what, I'm not going to marry anybody that's not a believer, that's not a Christian, that doesn't understand the spiritual significance of marriage, and so they just won't marry an unbeliever. Another thing, and maybe it's related to this idea of the unbelievers, but differing religions, and so I'm going to kind of play with that terminology just a little bit. In one way of looking at that is, I won't marry a believer to an unbeliever. The Bible teaches not to be unequally yoked together with an unbeliever. And so you may say, you know what, this is my policy. I'm just not going to marry I'm not going to marry a Christian to someone who's not a Christian. I'm just not going to do it. You both have to know the Lord. Or the other way of looking at this is participating in marriages that are outside of one's faith. We know that any time that two people enter into the marriage union and they have differing religious backgrounds, religious views, talking about different religions, and this may be Catholic and Protestant, or it may be Christian and some other religion, a Christian with a Jew, or a Christian with a Hindu, or whatever the case is. That you recognize right away, that's going to complicate that marriage from the very beginning if your foundation isn't, if you don't even know if you can't even come to a mutual decision about what marriage is, again, this mystical union between Christ and the church, then you're planting seeds that are going to grow bad fruit, and it's certainly going to confuse children along down the road. And so some ministers would say, I'm just not going to participate in a marriage that involves different religions. The other aspect of this too is, if you have been asked as a Christian minister to participate in a wedding with someone with maybe a Muslim, Christian is going to marry a Muslim, the Muslim family may also want the imam of their local faith community to participate as well. And then now you've got yourself working together with an officiant of a different religion, and you might just say, you know what, I'm just not going to fool with that. I'm not going to get involved. I can't participate, and so I'm not going to get involved with that. And then another issue is on the issue of minors. Now, every state We'll talk about the legal aspects of marriage in just a moment. But every state has marriage laws concerning an age of consent. And the idea of marrying minors comes into play in this regard as well. And so in most states, anyone under the age of 18 has to have at least some kind of parental consent, and that age will fluctuate depending from state to state. But you may also come to the place where you say, you know what? In 2024, again, this is not 1924. In 2024, I have come to the place where I cannot think of any good reason why anyone who is not legally able to go to the courthouse and sign their own marriage certificate needs to get married. Needs to get married. That's a big step. And so, so my personal policy is at this point, and I have in the past married minors. I've had to go back and with parental permission, but I've had to go back and revisit my own policy, and I just refuse to do it anymore. For any reason. My thought is, if you guys love each other at 16 the way you say you do, and you're going to make a life out of this, come back and see me at 8. You'll still be madly in love at 18, and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it again then. And so again, come into terms with whether or not I'll marry a minor. Then this idea of repeats. Will you marry somebody and then turn around and marry them again later? Coming back to now, of course, if you decide right away, I'm never going to marry anybody who's been divorced. I'm not even going to entertain that idea. You don't have to address this. But my personal policy is I will not marry anybody twice. I know that with the culture that we're in, and the idea of divorce, we talked about the religious beliefs of the scriptural underpinnings of what marriage is. Some people got married, they weren't even Christians when they got married. They got into a bad relationship, they got divorced a long time ago, or whatever, before it was under the blood. My thought is, I'll give anybody the benefit of the doubt. If you just didn't know, maybe you was too young, whatever the case is, I'm willing to give anybody the benefit of the doubt and at least sit down and talk to them about it. But I have routinely told people, I've been as bold as to say, listen, don't ever come back to me again and say, hey, that didn't work out, but man, I've met somebody now and she's the real deal. Again, you've got to come to that decision for yourself. And I know, and that can be tough with friends. It can be tough with members of your church, with your family members that come and say, well, you married me the last time, and I really would like for you to do it again or whatever. And you're free to say, well, I just don't feel comfortable going that route. And then the other thing that I threw in there, and I'm kind of bookending this list with two things that you should never do. And so the last one is extra legal weddings. And by that, I'm talking about solemnizing marriage vows for people who do not have a marriage license. Several years ago, there was a Facebook post where a friend of mine was asking the question about whether or not, just throwing this out there for a Facebook poll, whether or not you guys think it's necessary to have, to have a wedding, to have a legal wedding, or do you think it's okay if, we just make commitments to God and, God knows our love. Do we really need to stay involved with, our loved one for another? And of course, I had posted on there and mentioned that I didn't know of a single pastor who would even consider participating in such a thing. I know you guys are not going to legally get married. You guys are not going to go get a license and whatever. I don't know a single pastor who would get involved in that. Well, one of our mutual pastor friends commented and said that he thought maybe he might, depending on the circumstances. And of course, the two of us ended up, having a long conversation about that. And the bottom line is, in the state of Kentucky, it's illegal to solemnize marriage vows without a license. And, again, I know that some people are saying, well, in New Testament times, there was no state to go down and get a license to, and really isn't it just our commitment to God and this and that and the other? But the bottom line is, marriage is a legal recognition in the state, and so we need to be sure that we respect the laws of the state in which we live. And again, the idea that I would somehow or another pray a prayer, say a few words, and then condone people to live in fornication just goes so contrary to my own convictions. And so again, just the idea is set a clear policy that you feel comfortable with, and that you can say, you know what, these are the cases in which I will officiate a wedding, and these are the cases in which that I won't. And then the second thing is a consistent practice throughout your ministry. I told you that a couple of times in the past I have married minors, and I've had to go back and revisit that, and just have decided that in each of those cases, I cannot think of any reason why it wouldn't have been better to just wait and just give it time, and let's see. Let's just give it time. And so I've had to kind of go back and revisit that. And so now I guess if somebody that was 16 or 17 came to me and wanted me to marry him, and they said, well, you married so-and-so, I guess I would just have to say, well, if I had to go back and do it over again, I wouldn't have, which is not a polite thing to do. But you also, the last thing you want to do also is to tell somebody, no, I won't marry you because you have been divorced, and then down the road marry somebody else that has been divorced, and then find yourself, people questioning it's because of me. It's you don't make it a personal thing. Again, we return back to this issue of the litigious nature of our culture. And I told you, can you get sued? Well, yeah, anybody can get sued for anything, but you don't want to give anybody even if it's not a legal issue, they don't sue you. Just don't put yourself in a position to where somebody can come back and say their ministry is inconsistent and unstable. And so it's best to pick a policy, set a policy, and then keep it. Let's talk about wedding prerequisites. And I want to throw this out there. What does it take for me to be able to officiate, to solemnize marriages? And so I want to just talk about the religious requirements. Who can perform a marriage? Who can officiate a wedding ceremony? Now, again, religious requirements can vary based on the religion of who can officiate a particular ceremony and who cannot. And so some denominations require a certain credential, whether that is ordination or some sort of a ministerial license, and so some denominations will have a particular requirement for and will actually authorize the bishop or whoever to officiate a wedding, and then other churches it varies by congregation. And so the idea is that if the congregation endorses that minister to officiate a marriage ceremony, then they're good to go. And so again, just knowing who can officiate a wedding. The idea in the Church of God Mountain Assembly course, any minister in the church that's recognized by the church as a minister called of God, should be qualified. If they're qualified by the state, then they should be qualified. If they're qualified by the church, then they should also, and also qualified by the state, then they shouldn't have any issue solemnizing a wedding. Let's talk about legal requirements. Also, but again, marriage is not just a religious ceremony. It is a religious ceremony, and we should, when we're officiating weddings, we should make sure that those who are getting married, and make sure those who are participating in the wedding, and make sure everybody who is in attendance at the wedding recognizes this is a religious ceremony. This is a spiritual event, but it's also a legal. It's also a legal matter. And so let's talk about that just a moment. So legal requirements. I want to just mention the jurisdictional requirements for for officiating wedding, and so this has to do with by jurisdictional. I mean things like the license itself. Where is the license picked up and by whom? In most places, in most jurisdictions, the license is picked up at the county courthouse or some county governmental office, and it's picked up by the license is picked up by the couple who are going to get married. Also included in this, and these are things that ministers need to recognize that they do have a legitimate license, and also you need to be aware of where the marriage may take place. Now, in some states, if you get a marriage license in a particular county, you have to get married in that county. All right. In some states, you can get married anywhere in the state. You just have to specify it in there. Now, again, the marriage licenses are governed. Marriage laws are governed by the states, and so in the United States, those marriage laws can vary from state to state, and you need to be sure that you need to be sure that you know what the marriage laws are in the place where you're going to officiate the wedding. Now, in Georgetown, you may not have near this issue that we do down in Millsboro on the border. I'm in the tri-state area, and so we're just a few miles from Virginia, a few miles from Tennessee. And so I marry couples all the time in Tennessee, married couples all the time in Kentucky. Sometimes I marry couples who live in Kentucky but get married in Tennessee, or they live in Tennessee and they get married in Kentucky. There's always some confusion, but you want to specify that right away as the officiant when you're starting to talk to folks. You have to get married. You have to get a license in the state where the marriage is going to take place. And so, one time I had a couple that showed up at the rehearsal with a marriage license. We were going to have the wedding at the church. The night before the wedding, they showed up at the rehearsal with their license, and it was a Tennessee license. They thought because they lived in Tennessee, they needed a Tennessee license. And of course, invitations are already out. All the families coming to the church in Kentucky. And so immediately they start panicking. It is Friday night, by the way, and the Bell County Courthouse is not open on Saturday morning. That is not an option. And so, what do you do? And so I assured them that it was going to be just fine. We'll make this work. And so what I did was we had a wedding at the church. And then as soon as the wedding was over, we went to Tennessee and they renewed their vows. That's as early, sometimes couples renew their vows after 25 years. They renewed theirs after 25 minutes. We went to Tennessee, and I told them, I said, we can go to your house, we can go to the park, we can stop on the side of the highway if you want to. And so I married them right past the Welcome to Tennessee sign on the side of the highway, still in their wedding, wedding gown and tuxedo. And so again, the idea is making sure that you know where the couple is allowed, where they're allowed to get married. And then part of this, the jurisdictional requirements too is when and where does the license need to be returned? Where does this need to go back to, and by whom? In the state of Kentucky, Kentucky law requires that the officiant return the license back to the courthouse. And the license has to be returned within 30 days after it is issued. And so, in Tennessee, I know they've got to the place now where when they issue the license, they give a stamped envelope with the license itself, and so the officiant can just drop it in the mail and mail it back to the courthouse for them to return the certified copy to the couple. But in the state of Kentucky, we're required to return that license. And again, these are going to vary by state, but it's the responsibility of the minister to make sure that license gets returned to the courthouse. Now, there have been occasions where because of my schedule or what have you, or depending on where the marriage was at, what have you, there have been occasions where I have allowed the couple to return the license on their own. Now, I do that in cases where I have full confidence that the couple is going to be responsible and that they're going to get the license, to the courthouse where it needs to go, and they can pick up their certified copy when they drop off the original. But for the most part, even if it means me being inconvenienced to have to make a special trip or whatever, then I typically will try to do it myself, just to make sure that everything gets done where it must. And so again, I mentioned in Kentucky, their license has to be returned, completed within 30 days. That number is going to be varying by the state, and so you need to be sure if you're doing weddings outside of the state where you live, you should be familiar. Every minister needs to be familiar with the marriage laws in his state. But every now and then you're going to get asked to do a destination wedding. Somebody's going to say, "Preacher, I'm going to pay your way, to the beach if you'll marry us, in Myrtle Beach, or if you'll marry us, in St. Pete Beach or something on Treasure Island. I'm going to pay your way," and you're going to say, "Okay, my wife's coming too. We'll be glad to do that." But you need to be familiar with the laws of that state and know what you need to know. And of course, every marriage license is going to have a time frame that is associated with it, when it has to be returned, when the marriage must take place. Also, along with these legal requirements, you need to be familiar with what the legal requirements are for the couple. Again, this has to do with things like age. We talked about the age of consent and whether or not they're able to whether or not, what was required if it is a minor, what kind of paperwork has to be filled out. Also, every state has consanguination laws regarding how close of kin you can legally marry somebody. And so, there's a place on the marriage license for you to put your relationship to the spouse. And so, in every state, second cousins is legal. And in about half of the states, you can marry a first cousin. In a half of the states, first cousins are illegal. And so, again, this is another one of those issues that you need to be sure of in your own, before somebody shows up with a license, and hopefully that's taken care of at the courthouse. But again, if you know better, then you ought to do what you can. And then the other thing is too, that in some states require residency to obtain a marriage license within that state, and so the state would require the state would require that the couple live in the state where they're getting married, where they're getting the marriage license. The other thing, and I guess I probably forgot this too when I was talking about your own legal requirements. Every state's going to vary. I mentioned in Kentucky, you used to have to be bonded. Now, the state of Kentucky's laws are such that just about anybody can marry anybody in the state of Kentucky. Just about anybody can solemnize marriage vows. Now, the lady at the courthouse that I talked to a few years ago about this pretty much told me that that's not something that's broadcast out there or whatever, but you don't have to have any kind of official ordination or recognition to do a religious service. The idea is that your church, if your church endorses you, that if your church where you're a member at has no problem with you officiating a wedding, then the state of Kentucky recognizes that authority for a religious wedding ceremony. But a civil wedding, it's pretty much anybody who is a legal adult. And of course, you do have to be 18 in the state of Kentucky to do a wedding. So in some states, you have to be registered with the state. You've got to apply with the state. I think the state of Ohio, it's by county, I believe. And so from state to state, you need to know what is legally required of you in order to perform a wedding there. Don't just assume that, hey, I'm a preacher of the gospel. I got a card that says Mountain Assembly in my wallet. I'm good to go, because that may not be the case. And then the other thing that you ought to know also about the legal requirements has to do with the ceremony itself, the ceremonial. Number one, the number one legal issue is the idea of proxy. In some states, it may be permissible to do a marriage by proxy, where the one or both of the couples is not present. I don't know if that's kind of a COVID holdover or whatever, where you weren't allowed to be in the same building at the same time with people or what have you. But most states require that the officiant and the couple be together in the same place. And so again, that's another issue with the ceremony. Another thing that you need to be aware of, in regards to ceremony, is the idea of witnesses. In the state of Kentucky, every marriage has to be witnessed by two people. And I think in Tennessee, it's one witness is sufficient, and that'll vary by, in some states, you don't have to have a witness at all. And so again, know the laws of your particular state. In nearly every state, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit with when we talk about the marriage ceremony itself. In nearly every state, some verbal consent is required to make the marriage legal. Okay? And so you have to ask that person, do you know what you're getting into? Well, nobody knows what they're getting into, but they have to at least, consent that, yes, I am willingly entering into this covenant. That's accomplished by them saying, I do. We don't really think about that as a binding contract or what have you, but that's really its purpose, is to be sure that they know what they can verbalize that they're willingly entering into this marriage covenant. So in many states, that consent is required by the law, and in many states also, the pronouncement is also required by law. And so, again, we'll talk about that in the marriage ceremony, that the officiant is required by law. They're not legally married unless the minister pronounces them as husband and wife. And many times this is accompanied with, by the authority and under which they make that pronouncement. And so generally, that is by the state of Kentucky, and as a minister of the gospel, that I pronounce that they're husband and wife. And so again, these are just some ceremonial requirements that also we need to be aware of. And then lastly, and I think I touched on this already, the idea of the requirements of the officiant himself. I mentioned that in the state of Kentucky, you have to be 18 years old to solemnize marriage vows. I had an issue with this a few years ago when one of our licensed ministers was asked to do a wedding, and we had to track that down and found out no, and you do have to be 18 years old. I mentioned that in some states, again, you have to be a resident of the state to officiate weddings in that state. So you need to be sure that you're not working outside the law there. And I mentioned the idea of credentials. In some states, you have to be ordained in order to perform a wedding, or you have to have some credentials from a denominational body, a sponsoring body. In most states now, it's got to the point where credentials can be stuff you get online, and probably worth much more than the paper that it took to print them, or what the fee you paid to get it. But at least know what the law says in the state in which you are part of. Again, this is a wedding, just some wedding prerequisites that you need to know before you even get involved with the wedding itself.